At level 1 is the most basic of these groups, which are melee weapons that really make the wielder have to be proficient with personal, close quarters combat. One might think of lightsabers as one of these, but they're in a whole different category. What we're talking about here are the bare-bones weapons such as Gaffi Sticks, knives, staffs, and vibroblades. Gaffi Sticks were first seen being used by Tusken Raiders in A New Hope on Tatooine, but they were shown even more in the Book of Boba Fett when Boba was rescued, enslaved, and eventually befriended by the Sand People. Traditionally, these clubs were used to jab and beat their victims, but they were also used for more mundane tasks such as picking bantha teeth and prodding the sand. Certain Tusken tribes also laced the bent end of the Gadurfi with sandbat venom to paralyze their victims. Vibroblades also are in this category, which heavily featured in the Old Republic games, but it was also featured in the most recent video game, Star Wars Outlaws. This was yet another melee weapon that doubled as a useful tool that could cut through a multitude of elements. At the same time, it was more than capable of piercing the armor of a stormtrooper or gutting an animal. It was typically shaped to resemble a knife or sword, with the sharp tip of it vibrating and pulsating energy that helped it penetrate items more easily. The commando droids also prominently carried a vibroblade on their back, but obviously it wasn't really of help against a lightsaber. Beskad, which sounds very similar to the Mandalorian metal called Beskar, is a Mandalorian sword made of that very element, which makes it a viable weapon against a multitude of enemies, even Jedi and Sith warriors. The wielder of this weapon would typically be able to slash their opponent in a way that was similar to a machete, with a blade that was around the length of a grown adult's arm. We also saw the Mandalorian Beskar spear in the Mandalorian series, which would also be here. There were also a myriad of daggers and gauntlet variants for melee combat. Weapons like the Magna Guard staff would also belong into this category, but in general, I don't really see why anyone would be bringing a knife to a gunfight, or a staff in this case, unless you're a Jedi. You wouldn't be able to block anything with it. Also, before we move on to the next level, leave a subscribe to help the channel out. These videos take effort to make, and it means a lot to have your support. Moving on, at level 2, you have the primitive and projectile weapons that relied on old-school kinetic energy, and they were typically seen used on the Outer Rim more often. These are weapons such as cycler rifles, scatterguns, and various grenade types which required the wielder to actively throw the item like thermal detonators, dioxys, or ion grenades. Cycler rifles are commonly used by the Tusken Raiders of Tatooine, and these are the same weapons that they were seen using to pick off pod racers during the Boonta Eve Classic that young Anakin Skywalker won. These long-barreled rifles were also used by Boba Fett and Migs Mayfield, and they were extremely effective for long-range combat. We also had them in Dice Battlefront, where they could penetrate energy shields as they were an actual projectile and not an energy-based weapon. Next, we have scatterguns and slug throwers. These were a powerful slug thrower that was used during the time for the Galactic Republic and the Galactic Empire. This was a very popular weapon as it acted similarly to a shotgun, meaning it could spray a ton of projectiles that would hit their target, although it was somewhat limited in range. In Battlefront, this was yet again a weapon that could go through energy shields, and it was a nightmare when you played on the Jabba's Palace map, as it could instantly drop you. Also, it was said that unlike energy-based weapons, projectile weapons were a lot harder for Jedi to block with the lightsaber, as the slug that was fired from the weapon would melt instead of being deflected by the lightsaber, which would cause the fragments and shrapnel to scatter and harm the Jedi. Now to the grenades. One of the most grenade-type weapons used throughout the galaxy was known as the thermal detonator. Essentially, this was an electronic grenade that was used by official militaries and bounty hunters alike. One of these was famously used by Princess Leia when she impersonated the bounty hunter known as Boushh in Jabba's palace, and she pushed the switch forward to activate the sequence. Another interesting tidbit about them is the fact that the only person who can deactivate one of them is the person who activated it. A timer could also be set on them so that they could become ticking time bombs after being activated. The unstable chemical compound that was used to create them was known as baradium, which was a synthetic chemical compound found on the planet Denova. A similar weapon was known as ion grenades, which was a handheld grenade that would send out an electric shock when tossed into combat. This was extremely useful against vehicles, shields, and droids, as it was mainly used during the Clone Wars against the Separatist droid army. Also, stuff like Deoxys grenades, which released a toxic gas after being thrown, sonic imploders, which released a sound-based blast, or thermal imploders, which had even bigger explosion radii, were also frequently used. I also love the sound of Greedo's thermal imploder. At level 3, we have the standard personal energy weapons, which are most common weapons found in the galaxy. These are the weapons that were consistently readily available for the general public, and every slime ball with a heartbeat or an electronic pulse typically carried one of these. These included blaster pistols, carbines, rifles, or heavy repeating blasters. While these energy weapons were capable of shooting over long distances, the blaster pistol was much more efficient at close ranges and hallway encounters. Some of the more popular models of pistols included snub blasters, briar pistols, BH-4 double blasters, and heavy blaster pistols. Typically, most of these followed the same basic weapon model, but some also sported a two-barrel schematic such as the Blurg 1120 holdout blaster and the S-195 blaster pistol. Typically, blaster pistols such as the DH-17 were carried by Rebel Alliance soldiers, but each bounty hunter typically carried different models. Sabine Wren used twin Weestar 35 pistols, Han Solo used a DL-44 heavy pistol, and Cad Bane used a pair of LL-30 pistols. Then we have carbines, which were typically classified as either blaster carbines, disruptor carbines, or slug throwers. Blaster carbines were a shorter version of the traditional blaster rifles. Many versions of the blaster were also capable of shooting a short-range stun pulse that could incapacitate any target. This was one of the most common weapons in the galaxy, carried by nomads such as the Tusken Raiders, homeowners such as Owen Lars, B-1 battle droids which carried the E-5 blaster carbine, and Boba Fett even carried a modified EE-3 carbine rifle which ended up being his primary weapon throughout his lifetime. The Disruptor Carbine was a very powerful energy weapon that was used by bounty hunters and Wookiees. These weapons, along with the blasters, used blaster gas and an energy cell for power, but these weapons were actually illegal on many planets. Possessing one of these typically resulted in an instant death sentence if you were caught. There were very few people in the Galactic Empire that were permitted to use one of these, and they were mainly Imperial intelligence officers. Some examples of these are the 10 Lost Syndicate DX-2, the Merson model MSD-32, and the Class D detonator. Rifles were another favorite of mercenaries, bounty hunters, and soldiers, and just like the pistols and carbines, there were multiple types of rifles, such as blaster rifles, slug thrower rifles, and concussion rifles. Blaster rifles were the most common type used, and these shoot a powerful beam of energy and were meant to be fired from the shoulder. Blaster rifles have appeared in every Star Wars project in one way or another, but some of the most notable uses were the E-11 medium blaster rifles used by stormtroopers in the Galactic Empire, and the A-280 blaster rifle, which was standard issue for the Rebel Alliance. Finally, concussion rifles and heavy repeating blasters were also in this category. The TL-50 Heavy Repeater comes to mind, which was a fan-favorite blaster in both DICE Battlefront games, as it had a very high rate of fire. The E-Web Heavy Repeating Blaster Cannons, ROBA M45 Repeating Ion Blasters, and MWC-35C Staccato Lightning Repeating Cannons were weapons used throughout the Empire and New Republic, which acted like stationary and portable Gatling guns that shot powerful beams of energy. A weapon that was used quite frequently by the clone troopers while battling the Separatist army was grenade and rocket launchers. These weapons do exactly what you'd think they'd do, as they would fire explosive projectiles over long distances. The blast radius for these depended on the type and payload, but essentially being hit with one of these was pretty much the end. They were highly effective against vehicles and larger droids like Spider Walkers and Hellfire droids, but even Rebel fighters used these against heavier Empire walkers such as the AT-AT on Scarif. The Empire later introduced the Ion Disruptors as well, which fired a high-powered ion blast that could immediately disable any vehicles. It could also be used on people though, and was used to wipe out the Lasat race. For those of you who have been waiting for lightsabers to make the list, this is where they come in, at the very top of level 3. Even though they were weapons used exclusively by Jedi and Sith, they were fairly basic energy weapons to those who know how to create them. Powered by a kyber crystal that the user would pick out on one of their reflective journeys, the energy contained in the blade reflected what the Jedi was specializing in. A blue lightsaber was typically associated with the Jedi Guardian, a green blade was chosen by Jedi Consulars, yellow was chosen by Jedi Temple Guards, purple symbolized nobility, wisdom, and royalty, orange symbolized creativity and ambition, white typically meant that you tried to fall in the neutral zone between light and dark, and black was associated with the Darksaber, which was an energy sword created for and by the Mandalorians. Naturally, a red lightsaber was the iconic weapon of choice of the Sith Lords, but to do this, one had to bleed the kyber crystal of a Jedi. As for the white lightsabers, these had to be purified kyber crystals that were previously red. In level 4, we've got ground vehicles. These include stuff like the various walkers, tanks, and speeder bikes or hovercrafts. All of them are known for their strong armor that couldn't be penetrated by most weapons that were below this level, and were equipped with very strong blasters that were stronger than the handheld ones. Speeder bikes, for example, were very handy in the sense that you had speed mixed with firepower instead of armor mixed with firepower. Speeder bikes have been a part of every generation of Star Wars, but some of the most notable uses were during the Battle of Endor, where the Empire had scout troopers speeding around on 74Z speeder bikes. Bark speeders were also used by the clones during the Clone Wars, but the firepower of all of them was very similar. The 74Z speeder bikes were equipped with a forward-mounted, rotating AX-20 blaster cannon. On the other hand, Bark speeders were equipped with a forward-mounted, twin-light laser cannon. Generally, speeder bike weapons were energy-powered and delivered enough firepower to take out multiple enemies at once. The Separatist droids also used STAPs, which was a single trooper aerial transport. Walkers like the AT-ATs had 2 forward-facing heavy laser cannons and 2 chin-mounted laser cannons. The power of the heavy laser cannons was shown during the battle on Hoth when these vehicles were used to take out the shield generator of the Rebel base. On the other hand, AT-STs were heavily armored and armed, but power and armor was sacrificed in order for them to be more mobile and agile. These vehicles were equipped with a chin-mounted laser cannon and 2 side-mounted blaster cannons. The firepower of these wasn't enough to destroy large structures like the AT-ATs, but it was more than enough to take out squads of enemies on Hoth and Endor. AT-TEs also fall into this category, and they had a massive mass driver cannon and 6 anti-personnel laser cannons located on the body. The Separatist AAT, tank droids of the Republic's FAT and clone turbo tank all fall into this category as well, and were incredibly powerful ground vehicles. But usually, just like in the real world, the planes would triumph over tanks often. In Level 5, we come to Starfighters and the various gunships or smaller personal starplanes. First, the fighters, which include the X-Wings, Y-Wings, TIE Fighters, ARC-170s, Z-95 Headhunters, Vulture droids, and the list goes on the thousands of Starfighters. In general, Starfighters are usually more versatile, and their weapons could take on a lot of the armored ground vehicles quite easily, as most of them were equipped with heavy laser cannons and proton torpedoes. X-Wings, for example, were equipped with 4 Taman-back KX-9 laser cannons and 2 Krupp-X MG-7 proton torpedo launchers. TIE Fighters, on the other hand, were equipped with a pair of LS-1 low-temperature laser cannons that were capable of destroying a small spaceship, or something lightweight like a speeder, with one single shot. On top of that, certain models were also equipped with ion torpedoes that were efficient with disabling the shields on bigger ships. ARC-170s were equipped with 6 proton torpedoes, medium wing-mounted laser cannons, and rear-mounted laser cannons for defense against pursuing fighter ships. During the Clone Wars, these weapons were extremely efficient against the droid ships that didn't have any shields, such as Buzz droids, Tri-Fighters, and Vulture droids. And speaking of Vulture droids, they were originally equipped with blaster cannons that were hidden between their wings, along with 2 energy torpedoes that could be used against enemy fighter ships. Later on, they were modified to include 6 blaster cannons and 4 Buzz droid Discord missiles instead of energy torpedoes. What made the Vulture droid unique was that it had this walking mode, which made it usable as both a ground vehicle and a starfighter. Coming away from the starfighters themselves, which were usually just for one pilot, there are also the assault ships or shuttles. Falling into this category would be ships like the Millennium Falcon, the Ghost or the Razor Crest, which were both great for space combat and could still hold multiple passengers. Also in this level would be a ship like the Republic LAT gunship, and its counterpart, the Droid gunship. These were flying heavy weapons platforms that were armed to the teeth with missiles and heavy laser cannons to specifically deal with enemy infantry and lighter vehicles, while also capable of deploying troops right into combat. But there's still a level above these fighters and smaller spacecrafts. For level 6, we come to the massive capital ships that could lay waste to entire fleets over the course of a battle, but also served as carriers and lead vessels for fleets. These are ships like the Venator class, Mon Calamari cruiser, Imperial Star Destroyers, or the smaller light cruisers like the Republic frigate or Imperial light cruisers. Venator class Star Destroyers were used by the Galactic Republic and later transitioned into the Empire after the events of Order 66. 8 double-barreled DBY-827 heavy turbo laser turrets were located on the dorsal side of the ship, with AV-7 anti-vehicle artillery cannons also adding to its firepower. These heavy cannons were used to penetrate the hulls of nearby cruisers and helped with ground bombardment when attacking the ground. There were also 52-point defense turrets that fired energy beams as an anti-aircraft defense measure. Heavy proton torpedo launchers were found throughout the hull, as well as self-propelled heavy artillery turbo lasers that could penetrate the hull of a large cruiser with just one shot. Next, we have Mon Calamari cruisers such as the MC-85 Star Cruiser, which was well known for its rather strong shields. But still, its offensive power shouldn't be underestimated, as it still boasted a few dozen heavy turbo lasers, heavy ion cannons, and point defense laser cannon turrets that acted as anti-aircraft defense. It also came with half a dozen proton torpedo launchers similar to the ones found on the Venator-class shuttle, and could carry out orbital bombardments as well if it really wanted to. Imperial Star Destroyers obviously are one of the most recognizable cruisers in the galaxy, and they come with a lot of firepower. These destructive ships were equipped with 60 Tamenbach XX-9 heavy turbo laser batteries, 60 Borstel NK-7 ion cannons, as well as 6 heavy dual turbo laser turrets, 2 heavy ion cannon turrets, 2 heavy quad turbo laser turrets, 3 triple medium turbo laser turrets, as well as other anti-aircraft defense measures. The Super Star Destroyers also took all of this to an even bigger scale and level. The several light cruisers and corvettes, like the Imperial light cruisers, all could carry ships as well as rain down fire on enemy fighters if necessary. Moff Gideon's light cruiser comes to mind, as well as the Republic frigates or corvettes like the Tantive 5. But still, obviously, the light cruiser doesn't hold a candle to the Star Destroyers and capital ships. The Eclipse-class Star Destroyer is probably at the highest end of level 6, where it is a planetary threat for sure, but couldn't completely obliterate a planet by itself, as its super laser was a downscaled Death Star laser that could destroy the surface, but not the core of the planet. However, there are a type of weapon that will obliterate all of these capital ships with ease. These are the ones coming in at level 7. And finally at level 7, we come to super weapons such as the Death Star, World Devastators, Starkiller Base, Centerpoint Station, or the Sun Crusher. The Death Star was equipped with every laser cannon and turret known to the galaxy, which gave it excellent defense against aircraft from any direction. But the key weapon of the Death Star was the planet-destroying super laser, which was powered by a hypermatter annihilation reactor that was focused through giant kyber crystals that had been harvested on many planets such as Jedha. This weapon had to charge for quite some time and have a direct line of sight of the planet that it needed to target before being able to be fired. The World Devastators were used during Palpatine's Dark Empire campaign and could destroy a planet's surface, while at the same time use these resources to build a myriad of droids and such. Starkiller Base, on the other hand, was even larger than the Death Star, carried even more of the same weapons, had an entire ecosystem on the surface, and also had a planet-destroying laser. The difference is this laser could take out multiple targets at once and also shoot its beam through hyperspace. The Sun Crusher was probably the most overpowered superweapon, as it was able to destroy planets by turning the stars into supernova explosions. Its primary weapon came in the form of a payload of 11 resonance torpedoes. An oval-shaped plasma discharge was released after passing through the base's torpedo launcher, which caused it to travel at insane speeds to reach the target star. Also, its hull was impenetrable and even survived a hit by a Death Star laser. Add to that it's very small, and we've got a winner for the strongest superweapon ever made in Star Wars. With that, I conclude this video. Please like and subscribe.